You're watching Life Report, pro-life talk, real-world answers. Life Report trains people to more effectively defend their pro-life beliefs while honestly examining the strengths and weaknesses of both sides. We're the show other pro-lifers may have warned you about. This is Life Report.
Welcome to Life Report. I'm your host, Josh Brom. We have Liz Goddard here in studio, and we are joined by special guest, friend of the show, Steve Wagner, Director of Training at Justice for All. Steve, thank you for joining us tonight.
Hey, great to be with you all.
This is super cool. I brought Steve on for a special purpose for this topic because Steve is the author, in case our listeners somehow don't know at this point.
Since we've given him so much free advertising over the years.
Steve is the author of a book called Common Ground Without Compromise. It's one of the most important books for pro-life people to read, just generally speaking. You can get it at commongroundbook.com, where he's giving it away for free.
If you're the ebook type.
If you use PDFs at all, I don't want to hear that excuse. Like, oh, I don't read ebooks. Just download it, print the anyway. So Steve is on, and because he's read the book. He's read the book too. He's written the book too, and I've read it. He's perfect for this topic because we were talking about an issue and talking with people, and I mentioned, and it's probably not the first time I've said on this show, but I mentioned that I have pro-choice friends, and
it was the way you mentioned it.
How did I mention it? I don't even remember.
If I remember correctly, Andrew and I had a discussion after the show, and we were concerned that we were talking about, me and my pro-choice friends do this or this or that, and it sounded so odd to us. Like, what do you mean? Like, you and your buddies, your pro-choice buddies? What do you mean by that? And we had a really long discussion that we thought we'd kind of bring to the studio and see if we can get someone else's take on it, because right now we have kind of some different ideas of what a pro-choice friend, pro-life friend relationship would look like, and how do you balance things like that.
Yeah, and it becomes, I mean, it was interesting to hear, when we sat, in my office afterwards, and to hear the kind of concerns that Andrew had. I mean, he was pointing out the way that people might perceive what I said, and honestly, I hadn't even thought about some of the things that he was saying. I thought it was really valuable what he was saying. We're going to talk about that today.
Yeah.
So Liz, since Andrew couldn't be here tonight, unfortunately, I want you to you can try to be his voice as well as your voice, because I know you also have some concerns. You might not have all the same concerns, but I want you to kind of be able to bring your concerns to both me and Steve, as well as Andrew's, and just why don't you just try to clarify for us, what were Andrew's concerns about me talking about having pro-choice friends?
Sure. I hadn't really thought about it, and the thing with perceptions is that they're not necessarily the meaning that someone implies. And I wasn't getting the same perception from what you were saying originally, because we've talked about it a lot. I know that you have pro-choice friends, and it never really hit me as something that people might be concerned about. But when Andrew started talking about, well, what do you think people think? Think, as if we could do that accurately, but what do you think people's perceptions of you or myself talking about our pro-choice friends? And I think one of the main concerns that I have is there's a big push in academia and in society as a whole to kind of have a live and let live mentality, to be friends with someone who has a really different viewpoint and just do that. Agree to disagree. We're not going to talk about it. I accept you. You accept me. I'm pro-life personally, but it's really cool that you're pro-choice and that we can be together. And
we're just going to coexist, chat about life.
And when I thought about that, it was like, if we're saying I have pro-choice friends, and someone's getting that meaning, then maybe we need to rephrase the way we say it. And I've always noticed that I'm more like, this person I know who's pro-choice, or this acquaintance of mine who's pro-choice, but maybe that's a problem too. But I think there's a big concern to drop into that ditch of just accepting the other person and not really standing on your values.
Yeah. So that sets up our topic tonight. And here's what I want to talk about is this the broad question in front of us is, should pro-life people have pro-choice friends?
Right.
We'll define what that means in a second, what I'll say friend means. And I want to talk about both extremes that we should avoid. I think we probably would agree that there are extremes on both ends to avoid.
Always.
And let's see if we can find some consensus, even among, with you, and hopefully if Andrew were here, that he would, when he listens to this later, that he'll agree. Can we find some consensus that there's somewhere in the middle where it's appropriate if you're careful in the way that you have that relationship? So let me define friend real quick, and then I'm going to turn this over to Steve because I want to hear what Steve's thinking about this.
And how are you going to define friend for me?
Friend. I'm glad you asked, because
what are we
right
on?
Here I went to dictionary.com, and this was the.
Because that's reliable.
I'm kidding, I don't know. I don't have the printed version in front of me. What do you want from me?
I want Webster's 1828.
Okay, well I don't have that, but the
and that would be good if our conversation was happening
in 1828. That's right. Thank you, Steve.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
The current definition, because we're talking to living people, of friend is a person attached to another by feelings of affection or personal regard. I think that works pretty well for what we're talking about here. We're not just talking about a person that you're using your chess game of I'm going to make more pro-life people by becoming friends with them, and it's just all part of the pro-life battle or whatever.
No, there's
it's
attachment.
You actually care about. Okay, Steve.
Can we say it's someone you want to hang out with?
Yeah.
That's a good way to put it. I like that, Steve.
So, Steve, just right off the top here, just on the broad question, do you think pro-lifers should have pro-choice friends?
Well, I would have to ask a clarifying question, which is you probably would take to be characteristic of me.
Oh, yes.
I've got to ask, what do we mean by pro-choice? Do we mean pro-choice in statement or pro-choice in action?
I'm willing to say both.
Yeah, I think there is a distinction between. We all have friends who are pro-choice by what I like to call default. They don't really put themselves on either side of the issue, but it's neutral to be pro-choice. But I think we're more probably talking about what I'm more concerned about is the people who are not necessarily radically pro-choice, not necessarily out campaigning for Planned Parenthood, but who are definitely put themselves on the I am pro-choice. It is a woman's right to have an abortion, needs to go, things like that. And
that's probably an easier discussion to have, but I also want to include in this discussion at like another level. I want to talk about, can we have friends with people that work at abortion clinics? Friends with people that are maybe they don't work for Planned Parenthood, but they're lobbying, or they're on Facebook posting, hey, donate to Planned Parenthood. Let's keep that within the fold of this umbrella. Go ahead, Steve.
Okay, and this may be off the track of where you're headed here, Josh, but I would just suggest that there are many people who are pro-life in statement, but pro-choice in action.
Right.
Or their actions are no different, really, than someone who professes to be pro-choice.
Right.
So you have people in churches, for example. Many people we go to church with would say they're pro-life, but their lives are really no different in action than people who profess to be pro-choice. And I guess I would expand the question to ask, should we be friends with those people?
Wow. See, that makes this a huge umbrella now that we're talking about. Why don't we start?
Let's narrow in a bit.
Why don't I want to start by I'm going to just assume that most people listening think it's good to be friends with those people, at least in an attempt to win them over to be more active. And I want to focus us on people that actually say they are pro-choice, at the very least, and at most lobby for Planned Parenthood or even maybe work for Planned Parenthood.
Well, and I think let's go that direction. But this question may come back to help us to navigate whether or not we should be friends with pro-choice people. Because if the reason we shouldn't be friends with pro-choice people, if the concern is, well, it may make us compromise, or it may make our, it may affect our children, or whatever the reason is, may actually also apply to people who are not just pro-choice as their stated conviction. But let's go your direction, Josh.
Okay.
Let's head there.
Sure.
I completely agree with that. So take. Okay, go. I want
I was
to
say,
go to Liz.
I know, Josh, that you have some pro-choice friends. And this is kind of my approach on the subject. Is if you have friends who are stated and in some form of action pro-choice, my position would be that you really should be friends with them. You can be friends with them, but you should be trying to change them.
Okay.
Which is really difficult with kind of society's accepted norm of friendship, because I think there's this really norm of friendship that if you have friends, you don't try to change them, because that's not being a good friend.
Right.
That's being some kind of a activist. And well, frankly, we are activists. But I think if you have a pro-choice friend and you're not in some way confronting them, we talk about gentle ways to talk to people. We talk about being caring and being genuine, and really trying to understand their position. We talk about that a lot. But if you employ those, you need to be trying to actually change that person. To just sit there and be buddy-buddy with someone, and let live. That is what I think we need to specifically avoid.
Now, I generally agree with you, I'll say, but let me ask you a follow-up question.
Sure.
Let me get you a little bit more specific on that. How active do you think that I need to be with my pro-choice friends in getting them to change their mind for this to be legitimate in your eyes?
I don't know. That's that could almost be a case-by-case basis. And I know we've talked before about just a little bit on a show about when do you stop being friends with someone? How radical does that need to be? But if somebody is lobbying for Planned Parenthood and you have gone through the debate with them, I think there's an appropriate point where you say, look, I cannot be friends with you anymore. I cannot have this quality time and affection and interchange of ideas if you're not moving closer to my position, or we're not reaching some common consensus.
Steve, what do you think about that?
Liz, let me ask you a question about that.
Sure.
Let's say that this person, that you've had the pro-choice, pro-life discussion about whether abortion should be legal.
Right.
But let's say they are bonkers for human rights, and they are the person. Maybe it's the person in your life that is most concerned about human rights. Even put next to all of the people in your church or whoever. Let's say it's a person who's not even a Christian. What if you have a lot of common ground with that person on, say, sex slavery?
Right.
And it's an issue worth caring about, and you have a lot to discuss about it. In fact, maybe you're the only two people in your community who care, and you have common cause. What would you do in that situation?
Well, you definitely have the shared common ground, which I think can create that friendship and relationship, but that just the idea of having those common views and being a human rights activist is the exact platform on which we build our pro-life position. How can you be a human activist for all these different humans that are unwanted or forced to be in slavery and things like that? Those are the questions you'd need to dig with that person. And if they're not, and really, if a person is stonewalling and they're not moving on that point, I mean, like I said, it's a case-by-case basis, but I mean, you should be able to make headway with someone who has a platform of human rights.
But let's say you can't, because I can think of at least one or two pro-choice people in my life that I genuinely care for. They might not be the ones that I feel closest to or most want to hang out with, but I still feel a positive. I want them to be happy, right? And I'm not sure they're ever going to move, but we definitely can agree on things like sex slavery.
Sure.
So let's just assume. Let's just take Steve's example to the more extreme. Let's just say, yeah, you tried to find common ground on abortion based on the human rights things and the other things you agree with, and let's just say you just aren't able to get there. Some people do not become pro-life. At some point, they just shut off.
Let's say their view is suffering. Suffering is what makes all those human rights issues big issues, things that we need to be concerned about. And so the women who are being dragged into sex slavery or drugged into sex slavery, depending on which dictionary you're using, those women are suffering. And so that's why we've got to care about them. But they would say the fetus, at least in most, or the embryo in most abortions, does not suffer. And so there's a principled reason that they have for being against certain human rights violations and not others.
Do you remain friends with that person, Liz?
Like I said, depends on the person.
Okay.
I I think there's still a lot of discussion to be had even on that point. And we can get into, you know, how do you deal with arguments when people are saying that human suffering is the, you know, what other examples can you bring up?
Sure.
What other individuals can you bring out as examples as to why that's not a good reason for human value? And I think no matter what you choose to do, you still have to, and this is where I think my position of not being too buddy-buddy with a person can fall into a trap, is not treating them as a human individual, is not treating them as well as you would like them to treat the unborn. But I think the real danger is not whether or not you stay in some form of relationship with the person, because face it, everybody has extended family members who they have a relationship with, or friends, or friends' family members, or people that you're connected with through other means that are pro-choice to some degree, that you keep a relationship with. But you're not going to get the trap you want to stay away from is that I'm okay, you're okay.
Right.
The let's ignore this, or I'm just going to accept your position as valid.
Right.
Because that's absolutely not.
Liz, in your view, what makes this different than any other issue that you might have disagreement with friends about? I think any of us with any friendships that we have,
Oh yeah, no one's saying.
You're going to have some disagreements, but for some reason, it sounds to me like you believe a little bit differently about disagreements on abortion than you do about, say, disagreements on whether God exists, or maybe. I mean, certainly some of our listeners probably would put that in the same category as abortion.
Sure.
They'd say, you know, you shouldn't be friends with atheists for the same reasons. But what makes this different in your mind than, say, a disagreement about how to resolve some other ethical dilemma that maybe isn't the same as abortion?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think probably the one issue that most people would feel more strongly about would be religion. And we've all had to balance things like that in our lives. And I think another big one, political issues. I have friends all over the political spectrum. Right. And there's some balance. I think I'm kind of moving a little bit on this, but there's some balance you have to each of those. I don't have a lot of really liberal friends because we don't have a lot in common, and it's difficult because there's some moral and ethical boundaries that I don't cross to, or I'm not comfortable with.
Right.
So
let's talk about a
So
couple.
Liz, I think that makes a lot of sense. That common ground is what naturally produces friendship.
Right.
So I think one thing I would suggest here is if you have friendships naturally arise from conversations you might have, even with people about disagreements like abortion. If those things naturally arise, then I guess I would suggest, as a rule of thumb, maybe we let them naturally become whatever kind of friendship they can naturally become. Obviously, if somebody disagrees with me about things that I hold very dear,
it's not going to last very long naturally.
It's not going to, or it may not just not be as deep. I mean, I have friends who are pro-choice.
Andrew pointed out that he was concerned that there might be a perception that when I say I have pro-choice friends, that maybe pro-lifers take that and think, well, maybe Josh doesn't care as much about abortion as we thought. Maybe he's compromising. Maybe he has that you know, kind of, oh, let's just coexist thing. Do you agree that there might be a danger to that? And if there is,
there's definitely a danger to that.
Okay, so how do we avoid that? Besides me just describing exactly what I do have with my pro-choice friends.
Well, I mean, there's a huge danger. When you like someone and you're around them, you tend to, in a sense, merge together. And I've noticed this with coworkers, with relatives, family members. Somebody says something like, "Oh, gee, that Planned Parenthood bill. It seems kind of sad that they're taking all this money away from these people." And it's really easy to go, "Oh yeah, whatever," and just kind of meet in the middle and not make that conflict.
Right.
And that's where you're really compromising what you believe.
Right.
In avoiding that, and that can be a huge danger. But on the flip side, there's the danger of being the jerk who every time someone says anything that has to do with life, you slam down on them. Or every time somebody says anything in passing about about women's rights, you come up with, there are no rights for women because they're being killed in the womb and you don't know what you're talking about, or
well, since you brought it up, we got an interesting comment on our Facebook. Steve, I want you to respond to this. This is from Corey, who posted on our wall, and he said, "Of course you can have pro-choice friends. I'm a conservative, and probably most of my friends are liberals. Just like you can have friends of different religions, ethnicities, and political parties. Of course, every opportunity I get, I chastise them. And if they ever start talking that I'm pro-choice crap, I never let it go. But at the end of the day, they're still my friends." How do you think Corey could maybe improve a little bit on the way that he interacts with his friends that are pro-choice? Steve.
Well, I don't think that it's wise to try to, I guess, put in concrete language what happened with Jesus when he hung out with the tax collectors and sinners. But I just can't. I guess it's hard for me to imagine that Jesus kind of rubbed the truth about their sin in their face, or rubbed the disagreement that he might have had with them in their face. The Pharisees got mad at Jesus for hanging out with the tax collectors and for supping with them, for having dinner, and I think the implication there is that it was not all about the argument for him.
Right.
He was willing to come, I guess, befriend them to a point. Now, because he wanted to win them ultimately, but I think that would be the model that I would start with. So I think I would set aside certain of my. Well, I guess the question I would ask Corey is, Corey, what's the purpose of taking their pro-choice argument, their pro-choice ideas, I think you called it crap, and bringing, always naming it, always making sure that they know that you disagree with them. What does that help?
Yeah, I don't think it does. There's some discretion to when to overlook something and when is a good opportunity to make some lasting change.
Right.
But kind of the flip side to that gentle approach is, going forward with the Jesus example, we know that he also wasn't influenced by the sinners that he hung out with, and that's the danger that I see.
And Liz, it sounds like that's been your main concern, as we've discussed this issue for the whole time today, is that we will ultimately, if we have pro-choice friends, we'll just get to the point where we agree to disagree, and we become maybe
real soft.
Could it get to a point where the pro-choice friend feels like just by being friends with them still, you're being complacent? I actually posed that on one of the message boards where I'm friends with pro-choice people, and they kind of responded, well, obviously you do care about abortion because you have a pro-life job, and this is like everything you do.
But most people don't.
Right, and so for other people, I think we can certainly agree. There's extremes that you want to avoid. I generally agree with you that you want to be trying to move your friend to the pro-life position because it's the right position. You also want to avoid this extreme of acting like it's okay. It's coexist.
Avoid being the hypocrite. And avoid being the pushover. But you also want to avoid the perception of either. And that's, I think, for you and myself and Andrew and Steve, who work in the pro-life movement, we have a little bit of a higher standard to make sure that we're not being perceived incorrectly. And that's why we had this show, to make sure that people aren't perceiving you as being a pushover, when those of us who know you know that you're not. So
let's go specific. This is the situation I have when I say I've got pro-choice friends. Here's what I'm describing. I recently got involved in an online Facebook group of it's a private thing. You can't find it, and it's like by invite only thing, and someone invited me in, and I'm still there. There's about 20 people in there that I, over the last 4 or 5 months, after we've spent a lot of time together online, none of us no one lives around here, we are beginning to care about each other in a way that we didn't expect to, because we're not only talking about abortion. We talk mainly about abortion, but about 20% of the time we'll talk about something else. Well, on Fridays we won't even allow abortion discussion. We'll just talk about how's our week going. Someone just had a baby who's, and so we're all kind of, rejoicing with her. There's people who have gone through breakups during, and been telling us about it. And we've gotten into, pretty personal into each other's lives to the point that we have a certain affection for each other that I don't have with my other Facebook friends. It's not like, these are my best pals, but we care about each other, and to the point that we even want to meet one day and all get together and talk about abortion together. That's what I have.
Okay.
What do you think about that?
Well, it sounds like you're starting to move safely away from the hypocritical side, because you actually have some feeling in relationship for these people. So now you want to make sure that you stay in that spot and don't move too close to being a pushover, where you don't feel like you can speak your view for fear of creating controversy or conflict within that relationship.
Steve, what do you think?
Well, I guess I think it's neat that you can start a friendship with a disagreement.
That's true. It's not very common.
Let me do this. One other question to get to, and we're going to do this really quick.
Sure.
So Liz, your 30-second answer. Jason Jones said when he was here, he was talking about how at some point, he's had people that he's, after they wouldn't get to, after they didn't become pro-life, he wouldn't let them back in his house. So that became kind of this other kind of perception. So or idea. What do you think about that?
I think I can't really imagine myself getting into that situation where I would actually close my doors entirely to a person.
Right.
But I think looking at that through the lens of history gives it a little more credence. If you think about it, what would you think now about reading about an abolitionist during the Civil War, when slavery was apparent, not letting a slave owner into his house because he stopped talking to him about the issue and just said, I know your points and I'm going to keep my slaves.
Right.
It's, how do you know which is more effective? I don't know which is more effective, but I can see a justification for it through history.
And I want to briefly mention, because people did on our Facebook page, if you also take a look at people like Abby Johnson, who wrote a whole book about this, you take a look at Norma McCorvey, I hear, and other people that were pro-choice or even worked in the abortion industry that became pro-life, a lot of them did so, maybe not solely because of a relationship or a friendship with a pro-life person, but a lot of times that was a significant part of it, and that just seems to be
very important.
Going with that model of being like Jesus. I want to close the show by plugging jfaweb.org if you want to know more about Justice for All. I want to plug Steve's book, commongroundbook.com. It's Common Ground Without Compromise. If you haven't ordered this yet, what's wrong with you? It's free. I don't understand. Everyone likes free stuff. Steve, thanks so much for being on the show. Thanks for watching, and have a great week.
You've been watching Life Report, pro-life talk, real-world answers. Life Report is produced by Right to Life of Central California. Visit their website at fresnoprolife.org.
Thanks for watching Life Report. Please join us at 9 a.m. on March 24th for our annual Walk for Life. New this year, Lana Cafe will be providing free coffee for all of our walkers. To get a free walk brochure, call 229-BABY or visit us online at righttolifeca.org. Our phone number again is 229-BABY. That's 229-2229.